Yeah, my name's Colin Hynes. I live in Vauxhall and I'm originally from Jamaica.
Okay, thank you. What was it like in the 1980s? What did you do for your social life?
It's a very tricky one, that, because I was working, you know, but I was also interested in music. Still am. So I was doing a lot of music, a lot of work, a lot of music, a lot of work. And not so much clubs, because I don't really, never really like clubs. But I like photography and walking and cycling and, you know, martial arts even and those kind of things. It was very popular. I'm a songwriter first, I think. I've always been creative. I had records actually in the 80s, but I never considered myself as an artist because I had somebody else who was doing all of that stuff, the producer and stuff like that. So I didn't even know. It's all green to that word. Just like singing. I had records on the radio and stuff like that. I had a producer. My first record actually was a cover version of it's called Let's Do It Again. And I did that with a girl called Sonia Ferguson, and that was on the Cha Cha Classic label. And it played on the radio when I was at work, and people would think I was earning money, and I wasn't getting anything. I mean, you know, I didn't even know that's how it worked. I remember one day, you know, going to the cash point about a year later, and I didn't think I'd have anything in there, and I put my card in, and then it said I had like loads of money in there, and I didn't spend it. I went to the bank on the Monday morning thinking that was a mistake. He said, no, you got some royalties. That's the only time ever I've ever heard any money from music. Most people don't, you know. I've stayed in the same place, I think, for even now. I live in a flat in Vauxhall, but I've never lived in a flat before. We've always had houses and stuff like that. So it was a flat, still is a nice location, which I like. But the funny thing is, during the 80s, that area was very violent and nobody wanted to live around there. And now it's where everybody wants to live, a bit like Brixton. They used to have police vehicle called SPG, Special Patrol Groups, and they never had internet and stuff like that. So they'd sit in riot gear, you know, with albums, you know, pictures of people, and you'd walk past, they'd look to see if they recognize you. You could actually see them doing it. So it's a very tense kind of time. So even if you didn't do anything, and I didn't, you felt like you did, or you were made to feel like you did. So it's certain regions were quite tense. I'm only talking about the area that I know about, and you know that was like every day. I didn't spend it. I went to the bank on the Monday morning thinking that was a mistake. He said, no, you got some royalties. That's the only time ever I've ever heard any money from music. Most people don't, you know.
So what was your housing like in the 80s? Where did you grow up?
Well, let me see. I've stayed in the same place, I think, for even now. I live in a flat in Vauxhall, but I've never lived in a flat before. We've always had houses and stuff like that. So it was a flat, still is a nice location, which I like. But the funny thing is, during the 80s, that area was very violent and nobody wanted to live around there. And now it's where everybody wants to live, a bit like Brixton, you know.
So in the 80s, when you said it was very violent, you said that was still a flat or a house you lived in then?
No, it's a flat. It's a flat.
flat.
The area was violent.
Oh, okay.
You
And
know?
was that by yourself?
What do you mean?
Do you live by yourself?
No, I don't live by myself. I have children and all that sort of stuff.
But in the 80s, were you living by yourself? Who was living in the flat with you?
No, I wasn't living by myself. I had small children. I'm just saying the area was very violent. Let me explain it in a way. They used to have police vehicle called SPG, Special Patrol Groups, and they never had internet and stuff like that. So they'd sit in riot gear, you know, with albums, you know, pictures of people, and you'd walk past, they'd look to see if they recognize you. You could actually see them doing it. So it's a very tense kind of time. So even if you didn't do anything, and I didn't, you felt like you did, or you were made to feel like you did. So it's certain regions were quite tense. I'm only talking about the area that I know about, and that was like every day.
And was it a council flat? Did you own it? And if it was a council flat, was it hard to come by?
It was a council flat originally. It's not a council flat anymore. I bought it, like many people. Thank you for the 80s, actually, because that was a good move. A lot of people don't like to say this, but it was because of Mrs. Thatcher that made things like that possible. When Mrs. Thatcher brought it, the Prime Minister at the time brought in right to buy. And a lot of people was against it, a lot was for it. I personally thought it was a good idea, but you didn't really know how good, because you have to remember that during the 80s, Britain was quite poor and quite dirty. It's not a very attractive place. It was known as, I think, the poor man of Europe or the sick man of Europe. So I don't know if any of you travel. When you travel now, and you say you're from London, people are really pleased. Oh, London is great. But in those times, if you went to France and place, you almost be ashamed to say, well, I'm from London, because like the French, the Italian, everybody have something better. So the 80s compared to now, I think, were much worse than they are now. As I said, Britain was quite poor. Everybody, a lot of people, not everybody, was depending on the state. The state didn't have any money. Inflation was high. There wasn't so many jobs around, depending on what kind of jobs you could do. And it was a way of solving the problem, I think. That, if you owned your own place, you pay for it, you look after it, less money going through the state. What should have happened is that they should have replaced the houses that they're selling, whoever came into power. But for one reason or another, they didn't. I've never been a fan of any political party. It's just that I'm speaking about what happened in the 80s, and how it had a direct impact on people like myself. It wasn't only that. There was many other good things, like independent taxation, where before men and women, married couples, only the man got the allowance. Didn't matter, if his wife worked, he'd get all the allowances. She got rid of that, and she also made it possible for anyone to set up a business. Before, if you wanted to set up your own business, it's impossible. You'd have to have thousands and thousands of pounds, expensive lawyers, this, that, or whatever. So you just couldn't have it. So Britain became rich towards the end of the 80s. Became rich towards the end of the 80s.
You mentioned you had a job. What job did you do in the 80s?
I've always had a job. I've always had a job. I'm an accountant, So when you ask me, am I a fan of? Not really, but if you work in those circles, you see things slightly differently, because you're directly involved in the economy in one way or another. So you're not really a fan of anyone. The opposition, I can remember Michael Foot, I think it was, who was, or somebody else, probably not Michael Foot, somebody else, but it wasn't as good opposition at the time. So you remember what you remember, I suppose.
So what do you remember about the riots in the 80s?
I didn't see them. I heard it. I saw it on the telly.
Do you remember how it started, or
which riot?
The Brixton one in 81.
Yeah, I remember. I know of it. I know where it happened, and but this comes back again to the tensions that I was talking about within the communities. Brixton, in particular, it was to do with drugs, because it was famous for that. Brixton was a very dangerous place. And it wasn't somewhere it's somewhere you pass through. I didn't actually dwell there a lot. You pass through, you get patty there, chicken, all those kind of things, the regular things, and music, a lot of record shops, and West Indian food, of course, stuff like that. But it wasn't somewhere that I hung about.
So can you tell us a bit more about when you were saying that you have an idea of how it started? Like, what was your idea? What do you know, like, specifically?
And I don't have any specific ideas. I have the same views that everybody has. I wasn't on the inside of it. I learned about it from the outside. But I know that it was called Frontline, and it's really Railton Road, really going all the way up, and it was drugs. That's it. And that's died out now. But during the 80s and beyond was very rife. And it wasn't only Brixton. There's other places. But I think that was just a flashpoint. No, I'm not saying it started because of drugs. I said that's definitely a part of it, because that's where it was on that street where it all came to head and spilled out in other places. So, don't quote me and saying that's where it started. I've got no idea if that's what started it, but I know it played a big part in it. The relationship between the police and the public, how they understood or misunderstood, how they handled or mishandled situations. I'm not blaming anyone or saying I know the reason. I don't. Yeah, again, I heard about that, but I don't know about it. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, I mean, it's I'm the sort of person that wasn't really involved at grassroots on the street in anything. As I said, I'm busy doing my music, busy working, busy doing something else. And like a lot of people, you see things on the TV or somebody tells you their take on it. I don't actually, it comes back to the question again, what made it start? If you know what makes something start, because if you're protesting against something, you're not rioting, are you? You're saying, well, I don't like this, or this is my way I would express it, and you'd express it peacefully. A riot is a different thing. A riot is, when you run through the streets and you run anywhere and you smash up things and you create havoc. I wasn't there. I didn't see any of that. But when pictures come on the TV, those are the images you're left with. That's not necessarily all that happened. But those are the things you see, I think. I think it depends what sector you work in, right? Britain, London was becoming more technical. Remember, it moved away from mining, and there was a big battlers, with Scargill and Mrs. Thatcher and stuff like that. So Britain was very industrial at one point, and as I said, it was quite a dirty place. People would collect rubbish for weeks, and streets wouldn't be swept. In protests, there's a lot of strikes. Those are the things I remember because it affected me. If you're working, it's like going to work is difficult. Doing anything was difficult. So I couldn't say that one sector was more difficult than the other, because as one is closing, other ones are springing up. You know what I mean? But there was a definite transition between manual work and more technical work. Computers were coming in and things like that. So obviously, if you were doing physical jobs, say in mining, which was a heavy industry, or in the railways, which was being nationalized and stuff like that, or denationalized, you would experience higher unemployment, because you're having to move away from that, retrain and learn something else and whatever. I mean, it's not only in the 80s, it was there every day, and you can either ignore it as much as you can, you can avoid it as much as you can, but it's there, in loads of ways, in lots of different ways. But you can't live your life and saying, like, if you went for a job and you didn't get it, it's because I'm black. Do you understand? Find another, we'll overcome that then. It's all right, be better. Do you understand? Of course, all of us have that within us. All of us. But yes, there was racism. There was racism when I was going to school. There's racism now. It's comes in different shapes and, you know, in different forms and things like that. But I think it's a lot less now. People are more open. People mix with one another more, which is brilliant.
What's your take on like young people? Do you think they're politically aware?
I think they are more than I am, more than I was then, because especially when we're, I remember watching a lot of young people when the Brexit vote came up last year and stuff like that. And they were really annoyed that because they fell under the age of 18 or whatever it is, they didn't have a say, and it's their future is affected. And I strongly, you know, I would say that they should have a say. They're very clued up. You know, they read a lot more than I did about stuff like that, I can tell you. And they know. I wasn't really interested in politics then at all. You know, but I know a lot of teenagers are interested in it now. I hear them talking about it. You know, I see their reactions to it and their debate and that kind of thing. It's very empowering, I think. Keep it up.
The first person that said that.
Well, I believe it. You know, you having the right to buy shares in British Telecom, for example. You know, those became available, and people. I remember when I was working in a practice, everybody ran out and bought shares and sold them like a couple of days later and made like hundreds of pounds. And in the late 80s, I don't know if you've heard this phrase called yuppies. Yeah? Well, the yuppies were like, the main thing about the yuppie was, apart from the money that they earned, was that the equivalent of a mobile phone was a filofax. A filofax is just a notebook, basically. But they would go from like 300 to 3,000, 4,000 pounds for. And everyone would walk around, anybody who was anyone, not me, you know, would walk around with a filofax. And that was like the status symbol in business if you were doing well. And at the time I was in Battersea, I remember, because there was a storm in 87, the Great Storm, I don't know if you know about that. So in 87, my second child was born. So I remember that vividly because I got up the next morning and I was going to work and there was trees everywhere. I mean, everywhere. You'd never seen anything like that. Huge trees across the street, scaffolding blown down. You couldn't imagine it. You know? But in the same breath as that is happening, there was like the property boom in a one-bedroom apartments with like nearly 300,000 then, you know, just before the 90s. So there was a lot of money and a lot of development around. So that's the way I see business influencing and the transition in Britain and stuff like that. It's difficult to answer that because it was a good thing then, right? Everything was changing. You know, Britain was being opened up as never before. Everybody wanted to come and do business in London. And so everything was up for grabs. The building societies were, I think Centrica, one of those took over one of those, Abbey National or something, you know. And if you had £100 in there, they'd pay you like £1,000. You know, everyone was getting money or giving money to somebody. But you know, it was a strange time because you went from seeing a lot of, I wouldn't say poverty, but a lot of derelict places around to like, boom. You know, Battersea's completely changed. Vauxhall's completely changed. That's been going on from the 80s. You know, there were wharfs and places like that. Even Tower Bridge, you know, it's all industrial. It's completely changed. You play a part. It's like putting on a costume and going on stage. I actually hated it because the minute you put on any clothing, you're judged as, you know, what you do. And one of the things I disliked about that, you were talking about, did a lot of people get in trouble with the police and stuff? I was one of those who was stopped regularly, and sometimes my fault for driving carelessly. One thing I have to say, you know, is that there was no cameras around. You could park anywhere. There's no yellow lines practically. You could park anywhere. You know, they were really good things. You could drive up to the West End, leave your car anywhere. You wouldn't have to pay anything, any day. Do you know what I mean? It's like a different world now and stuff like that. But well, part of that has to be true. But there's always selfish people in every decade, every era. You know, that's either their nature or the circumstances they find themselves in. You know, people take advantage of what's available. It wasn't necessarily because they're greedy. They made it rich and they want everybody to know that they were rich. And I mean, I remember the first time I saw somebody with a mobile phone, I thought it was obnoxious. Because they're like walking down the street and you could hear this like, and you thought they were talking to themselves because nobody had one. And if you did have one, you couldn't talk on it. It cost a fortune. I tend, you know, because most of the time I've worked in places where I'm either the only black person or one other black person, something like that. I tend to get it from the other side. I get the indirect racism because people will look at you and there's an expectation that there's two things. Either he must be really good, that's why he's working here, or they've got to test you out to see if you're as good. So you get that all the time. So I suppose you learn to rise above that. You know, you never really do because you're always being challenged one way or another. But I think, you know, London was always a nice place, and you always had pockets of people that were not very nice. The police have been made to be more accountable now, whereas before they would just stop you and give you tickets or drag you down to the police station. You know, they didn't even have any reason. They just made it up. I remember being called down there one day for like loitering with intent to commit an arrestable offence, Vagrancy Act, you know, and there's nothing you could do, and they fine you, you know, and you didn't do anything.